It's time for Pure Performance.
Get your stopwatches ready. It's time for Pure Performance with Andy Grabner and Brian Wilson. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Pure Performance. My name is Brian Wilson, and since today is actually the day before Halloween, and this episode is airing just after Halloween, I'm going to introduce my co-host as Andy Candy Grabber. Hello, Andy. How are you doing?
That's interesting,
right?
Especially the grabber thing, right? I mean, that's.
Candy
I know
grabber.
it's related to my last name, Grabner, and not that you were intending anything else there.
Well, you're a candy grabber. You know, like that's what you do on
Happy Halloween
Halloween.
to you too.
Yes. Are you? You sound a little under the weather. Are you feeling okay?
Yeah, I'm just have a strange thing with my voice. I don't know what happened over the weekend. My wife Gabi is also trying to figure out what I did wrong because she's fine, and we made it for the weekend. And I ended up with having a very strange, rough voice. And I promise I didn't excessively drink nor smoke cigars, so that's not what it was.
Okay, but maybe other things. All right. So with that, we have a repeat guest. Ben Rushlo is back with us today. Ben, hello, Ben. Let's just get to you, Ben. Hey, how you doing?
How are you?
Good. Hey guys. Hey Andy. Hey Brian. Thanks for having me back. I guess I must not have been too horrible the first time. So, and happy Halloween, I guess, day before Halloween Eve.
Yep. And thank you. Before you reintroduce yourself, I do want to refer listeners back to episode number 70. This is episode 74, so just go back 4 episodes to episode 70. You'll hear kind of part 1 of this conversation where we talked about a lot of the real user and synthetic type of topics. This is a continuation of that conversation, so please go back. If you haven't listened to that, listen to episode 70 first, because the context will carry over into what we're discussing today. But with that said, Ben, do you want to reintroduce yourself in case anybody is ignoring my advice to listen to episode 70 first? And let us know who you are, who you work for, and why we should take seriously anything that you have to say today.
Sure, yeah. So I'm Ben Rushlo. I work for Dynatrace. I'm the Vice President of Services, which means I have kind of half of the global services teams, and we're focused on what we call DEM, which most people don't necessarily know what DEM is, but it's really kind of synthetic, real user, and session replay parts of our product, and really helping our customers make the most out of that, those product areas, and kind of understand how to improve performance. In terms of why you should listen to what I say, I have no idea. I don't have a great answer for that, except for I've been doing it for a long time, and really what is interesting to me is all the customers that we get to work with, and so when you're listening to me, you're really listening to thousands of customers over the last 20 years that I've been doing this, and kind of their stories, but I just get to tell them. So that's cool.
Hey, Ben, actually, this reminds me, we obviously work for the same company now, but we go back before we both worked at Dynatrace, right? Back when you were still at Keynote. Way back. Yeah. This was in the days when we had the Dynatrace Ajax edition, and you brought us in for a couple of engagements to analyze web performance issues that you discovered with your larger enterprise clients. And that was actually a really cool thing. That a lot of blog posts on my site came out of these engagements, also product improvements. And as you said, right, we're all here, Brian, you and I think we're all in the lucky situation to speak with a lot of customers and learn from them, and then using a channel like the podcast to give it back to the community. And that's pretty cool.
Absolutely.
It is cool. Yeah. I remember the Ajax edition. It was such an awesome product. And I remember, kind of just taking the industry by storm. And then, the working with you, it was great. Yeah. Until we couldn't work together anymore because we were competing, and now we're all one big happy family. So it's an interesting story, I guess.
Yep. So, building on the previous one, right? So Andy, obviously you were not able to make it. I think you were held up by Der Kommissar last time, if my memory serves well. It just came back to me now, right? So glad to have you back in this conversation, because I know this is a topic you're very knowledgeable and passionate about as well. We're speaking about RUM topics, synthetic topics, just basically, the end user, that end experience. What's the whole point of your application? What performance considerations and things to look out for that in that side. So Ben has given us graciously a list of topics he enjoys talking about. Was there any specifically that you wanted to tackle first, Andy or Ben?
Excuse me, I have a few more questions if you don't mind.
I think I will let Ben, start, because he obviously he's our guest today, and I know you have a list. So Ben, what do you want to talk about first?
Well, I think we'll tackle kind of the idea of how does real user monitoring? How do I see real user monitoring kind of as being the voice of truth for performance? And I think that's, I don't know, I'd be curious what you guys think, but I know that we've all done this for a long time, and what I find is that there's so many kind of voices screaming to our customers about this is what performance is, and it can be silly things like, oh, the CEO on his or her computer went to our site and they think the site is slow, right? And that sounds silly, but you'd be surprised how many times I hear that actually. To hey Google, because of course Google can go into any of our clients with their name recognition. They've come in and they've run some tests, on 2G or 3G, which is kind of their common approach, and they tell us our pages take 30 seconds, and so that becomes sort of what executives are then spouting to all the teams, and so I guess that's to me an interesting topic, which is, you can't even talk about optimizing performance until you sort of know what the voice of truth is, right? And if you have too many voices, then what you spend time, I think, at least we've seen with our customers, you spend time doing is really running from voice to voice and trying to vet and understand, well, this doesn't match with this and this doesn't match with this. And, and you don't actually get to optimize performance, right? And so for me, I guess what's so exciting about a real user product, and kind of hopefully getting our customers to look at that as the single voice of truth for performance, is then you can spend more time actually optimizing versus kind of arguing and debating about, oh well, the QA team uses this headless browser, and the CEO is using kind of a stopwatch on their machine, and we also have this other data source that we think and Google's coming in and telling us, and the reason I keep saying that is because I have a few customers where that has created so much noise, the Google kind of involvement with our customers, or I guess even other ways, like, hey, I've used Chrome DevTools, and I did a few measurements, or I used web page tests, and I ran a few measurements, and that's the voice of truth, and that's really challenging. So yeah, I don't know if you guys have experienced that as well, but I think that's the explosion of performance tools has not really helped us necessarily get to what is really true, what is the user experiencing, and how do you actually optimize that.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, I agree with you, but I think we also need to differentiate between measuring performance as in the metrics that we've been talking about, whether it's page load time or rendering, visual complete. And so these are obviously important to look at from a real user perspective to really figure out what's happening out in the real world. Another aspect that we do not get at all from anything that we do synthetically, and it also obviously includes our product, is what are people really doing on our page? How are they navigating from entering the page until they're checking out? And we can optimize performance as much as we want if the path, the journey, right, is terrible, not based on what we think the journey is, because if I can write a synthetic test and write it in a way how I think people navigate through the system, but if I actually see from real user data how people are really navigating through the system, I may identify performance bottlenecks that are not, let's say, the classical performance bottlenecks in terms of response time is high or it takes long to load, but it's actually a performance bottleneck in terms of it takes me too many steps to get to the point because the page is simply not intuitive enough, or it renders differently on a certain screen, therefore certain buttons are not visible and people have to scroll around and find things. So I think this is the conversation I also have a lot, is learning from the real users. How are they getting from point A, which is entering your website or your mobile app, until they achieve what you want them to achieve. Right? It's a whole journey. I think we always need to talk about the journey, and that's the key thing. And nobody can simulate this accurately because we don't know our thousands and millions of users and what they do.
Yep, I think that's a great point. I mean, it kind of gets to another topic we have on our list, which is this intersection of behavior and performance. And I think that's where, the future generation of really kind of performance superstars at our customers are people that understand what you just said, which is performance is only part of the equation, right? And so if we're so focused on well, if we hit sub 3 seconds for visual complete, then that means, the business outcomes will be achieved. Well, that's super simplistic. And as you said, there's lots of other things that affect our ability as customers or consumers to interact and, and get done what we want to get done on the site. And it can be poor design, poor UI design, tricky buttons, all sorts of things, right? And so I think you're exactly right that, we need tools that help us both understand performance, and I think path-based performance is super important, but also path-based sort of behavior, right? So are people dropping off at certain points in conversion funnels? Are people kind of struggling? And that's where I think session replay combined with, real user has an interesting, value proposition, because it is hard to know when you say, well, people are dropping off here in a funnel. Why is that, right? Well, we can look at performance and say, well, no, performance is good. So, okay, checkbox. Hopefully that's not the issue. And then you can kind of, guess about UI design. But as a performance person, that's not my specialty, right? But if I can actually see the sessions or see a number of sessions that are struggling at this drop-off point and actually watch what's happening. Oh, wow, they're getting confused, about this button, or they're getting some sort of, front-end JavaScript error that we weren't really detecting or not really understanding how that's affecting the UI. That's pretty cool stuff, actually. So I'm very excited about kind of bringing that piece into the equation, because it's going to help us who aren't UI experts to sort of see what the user is really doing and hopefully, give us some hints about what might be going wrong, I guess.
Yeah, that just actually sparked a thought in my head. Not major contribution, but the idea of this whole replay, being able to see the user interact with the site. I can't remember what site it was recently where I was going to click a button. So it has a button with text in it, right? And when I go to click the button, nothing happens. Why? Because you have to click the text in the button. That's the active part, right? Which is the dumbest design, which probably, I have no idea what kind of impact that had on the thing, but I know I myself was really frustrated. Fortunately for whoever it was, I didn't give up on using the site, but that's the kind of thing that you're not going to see from statistics, right? From seeing whatever performance metric that you want to capture. It's not going to tell you that users are getting frustrated and clicking several times because you have just like bad button design. I don't even know why that design exists, or I can't, again, I wish I could remember where it was, because they do deserve to be shamed for it. But,
it's one of those problems where it's like, we're too close as designers. I think I say we, I don't design, but I think they sometimes can be too close to the problem that they don't really realize what they think is intuitive, because, hey, they're the ones building it, right? And kind of putting it together, is not intuitive. And I have actually a Dynatrace example, which is kind of silly, but we're developing this wiki page and we're talking about some notifications to customers around changes in our product space. And I'm not involved in that, but I asked one of my team members, hey, where's our stuff? Because I'm clicking on this wiki page and I can't find it. And they're like, oh, well, you don't click on the link. You actually click on this very small arrow that's next to the link, and that opens a sub menu. And it's like, and again, maybe I'm the only one that's an idiot that doesn't understand that, but it was super not intuitive. Yet the people that are developing it on our team were like, oh, of course, this makes sense. You click this little sub caret that's 1 pixel, right? And then it expands. And I think that's exactly the challenge is, that we don't know what you don't know, because you don't know where your customers are coming from in terms of their frame of mind, in terms of is this intuitive, right? So I think the session replay will be super, super interesting there to short circuit all those guesses. Well, I think it should work this way, or I think customers will understand. It's like, well, let's actually watch and see what customers are doing, which is really, really cool.
And I think that's a great point too, because if you go back to when the iPhone first came out, or even just as it's working, right? There was barely any instruction manual. The whole thing was designed so that you can easily figure out how to use it. In fact, I have 2 children now. One is 7 and the other is 9, or is she 8? No, she's 7.
That's
I need to know these things. She's 7. And actually my second child has developmental delays, right? But she was able to pick up the iPad and figure out how to use it, right? Both of them at very young ages. And I bring that up because you talk about that UI design where you had to know to do the carrot. You shouldn't have to know, like, good UI design you can figure out just by looking at it. And then I guess the flip side of that is, or not the flip side, but the takeaway from that is being able to see how your customers interact with it helps you determine whether or not that's good UI design. But anyway, we're going into UI design. I just wanted to make that point because I thought it was a real amazing feat that Apple was able to create an interface that like 2-year-olds can figure out, like literal 2-year-olds. It's amazing. But
I want to just add one more thought on this because I was just at DevOne at our conference in Detroit 2 weeks ago, and Holger Weissboeck, he's working at Dynatrace and is leading the UX team, and he did a phenomenal presentation about it's called Let's Put the U in UX, and he really talked about UX versus UI, and he brought a lot of these examples on what can go wrong and what we can learn, and from bad examples, but also from our real users. So I can, Brian, I would love to put the link in. It's called from Holger Weissboeck, Let's Put the U in UX, and there was a recording from his session that he did earlier this year at DevOne in Linz, and it's a great presentation that he did, and it's eye-opening. And the other presentation that I saw in Detroit was a presentation around accessibility. And what was interesting there, the presenter, she ran us through an experiment where she used a screen reader to navigate or let us read the page that she was once designing. She was part of a project and had to design a page, and she was very happy with it. But then people came and basically complained about that it's not really accessible friendly. And then she used the screen reader, and it was phenomenal to see how complicated the page was structured, especially for people, that have certain challenges with either reading or navigating through these pages. And it was another great session on accessibility. And again, I know it's kind of diverting a little bit, but on the end, it's part of the topic we were just discussing. It's about user experience is more than just measuring the page load time of individual pages. It's the full end-to-end journey.
Yeah, let's link all those. I mean, I think especially the accessibility one, I have, physical stuff like that with my daughter. But what you see out there in the world of the internet is if you think people don't care much about security, the amount of people who actually care about building accessible apps or web pages is probably much further down on priority. So I think that's a topic that people really need to start taking seriously. So let's put those up. That's great.
Cool. All right, Ben, what's the next item on the list?
Well, I think, I don't know, I guess I'm curious because it kind of brings up the next item, which is performance, tools and kind of the intersection of, behavior and performance, but more, how it relates to, traditional analytics. And I think this is an interesting one. I don't know if you guys run into this, but a lot of times I'll be with customers and they'll be asking me things like, well, we already have Google Analytics, right? Or we already have Adobe. Everybody has Adobe, really. I mean, Adobe's part of a bigger framework, but they obviously bought Omniture and the analytics tools there. And so don't we already have kind of what RUM provides? And then on the other side, you have performance people saying, well, I already have kind of a RUM tool, right? Maybe I'm getting it free from my CDN, with what Akamai is doing with SOSTA, or, I'm kind of, getting some RUM data from even web server logs or something, right? I'm getting some data about real user performance. And I think, what's interesting to me is kind of bridging those gaps. And we kind of already talked about that. Makes me think that the performance person of the future, right, really has to have kind of, I was going to say a leg in, but then I'm thinking there's probably 3 things, right, in performance and behavior and UX, UI, right? And so, you can't have 3 legs. So maybe leg's not the greatest analogy, but you have to kind of be able to bridge those topics, right? But I also think tools that do that are really important because they do break down those silos. And we get, a lot of folks will kind of question, well, why in your tool, Dynatrace, your RUM tool, do you have this behavioral stuff? because we're already getting that from Adobe or Google Analytics. Again, most enterprises, it's typically Adobe. And what I always say is, I know as a performance person and dealing with a lot of performance people that one of their frustrations is I'm doing all this stuff to optimize performance and I have no idea how it affects, customer behavior. And the reason I don't is because there's these silos in our organization where, I can't actually get that data, right? It's like locked down because it's Adobe is the voice of truth for the business. And, there's maybe sensitive data in there about conversion or engagement, and therefore I can't get it as a performance person. And so what I always say is like, that's what we're trying to do is bridge this gap, right? So that when you make an optimization change, you can actually see, does that result in, more time spent on the site, more clicks, right? More engagement, more conversion. And I think that's really an important piece. I mean, Andy, you brought it up, is like, you can't be so disconnected from, how performance is only one part of the picture. And, the work that we do as performance people has a big effect on behavior. And like, we need to actually understand that. So I think that's an interesting topic, is like, this bridging of those two. And is it, do you use multiple tools? Do you use the same tool? Is it dangerous if you have kind of the similar data, but not exact data? We run into that a lot. Like, well, the Adobe data doesn't exactly match what you're showing us, Dynatrace. And therefore, does that create more challenges? I'm curious what you guys think about that, but it's very, very top of mind for us as we go and talk to people about performance and behavior. And they sort of say, well, I have these other 5 tools, right? And, or, I have this tool that does that or this. And it's an interesting topic for me, I guess.
Yeah. So let me bring, I mean, I like what you just said, and I have an analogy, or not an analogy, but it reminds me of something that happens in the past in our industry. Remember the days when Steve Sodders came to the world and said, don't start optimizing the back end because 80% of the time is actually lost on the front end. Remember that?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And so if we look at performance engineering, where Brian and I come from the back end performance, and we would have been tasked to optimize performance by 50%, then shaving off 50% of something that doesn't really make a big dent.
Of 20%, 50% of 20% is not too much.
Yeah, it's not really a whole lot. But we could tap, tap ourselves on the shoulder, and we could hug, and everybody's happy on the back end because we just optimized performance by 50%. But we would be happy, but probably nobody would really have notice it. And obviously, over the years, we learned we have to look at the full page load time, and we need to factor in all these other things that are actually happening when loading a page. And I believe what you just said is the next step is we should not focus on individual pages, but we need to figure out how does this impact behavior. And I agree with you. I hear this all the time. I believe I work more with backend folks than with business folks. And when I ask them, do you actually know how is your feature used out there? Do you know what impact you make with your deployments? Do you actually know what type of people you actually have on your website, which browsers they use? And then they say, well, we have this information somewhere on the business, but it's either hard to get it, or they don't want to give it away, and then it doesn't really make sense to us because it doesn't correlate to what we see with our tooling that we have on the back end. So I completely agree with you. The challenge is there is individual teams bringing their individual tools. They kind of guard their data. I've also seen, and maybe you've seen this as well, I've also seen people that are massaging the data into their favor, because obviously in the end everybody needs to report to somebody, and then you massage the data so that you can show that you've done a good job, even though it's not the truth. And I agree with you that this bringing the full stack monitoring, and full stack includes the end user all the way to the back end and all these metrics, and providing it in one tool, and then taking these individual metrics and giving it to the right stakeholders, and especially providing that correlation is I believe the next big step. And I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, we've been talking a lot about DevOps, kind of bringing Dev and Ops closer together, and I'm pretty sure that the next step is bringing business closer to DevOps, and then whether it's biz DevOps or whatever you want to call it, I'm not sure what's the right term right now. What's the term people use? Is it biz DevOps?
Yeah, I think that's the term. I mean, I think you're right, because a lot of the work that we get to do, we do work with a business, and it's amazing when you can turn a business person on to understanding why performance actually matters in the context of a bunch of other things, right? And that's where I think you have to be a bit nuanced as a performance person. You can't go in and say, hey, well, your only goal, Mr. Business Person, Mrs. Business Person, is to optimize performance, or get performance under 3 seconds or something. They'll laugh at you because, of course, they have a bunch of other things, right? They have features, they have, obviously all the business metrics, et cetera, that they have to kind of manage within that performance program. But if you get a business person to really get excited about seeing performance as one of the factors that will make them successful or not successful, right? Will make their application successful or not successful. It's amazing what change that will do in the organization, right? So, we've seen that where we'll be talking to performance people and, they're great people, but they just can't get that traction. Like, they can't get the budget, they can't get the time slices that they need to actually improve performance. But if you can get to the business person, and I think we talked a little bit about this in the last podcast, but you can get to the business person and kind of show them, you guys are way outside of normal. Your competitors are kind of kicking your butt in these areas, in terms of performance, and you get their mind share that performance matters. And I think that's why showing behavior and performance intersecting is important. Then you can actually see change in the organization, because all of a sudden, the money frees up, the time frees up, the focus frees up. They want to see, kind of metrics back to them at a business level. That really changes things. And I think that's where we get the most excited when we start working with customers, is like, okay, this is going to be a great customer to actually see change through the organization. So yeah, I think that's a super important thing, is that next evolution. And I think your analogy actually hit that pretty well.
Yeah, and the one thing I wanted to add to this was just the idea of the multiple tools and all the data. And I'll see if I can find the link again. But there's a great article discussing the difference between data and information, right? So I use data very specifically. I think I discussed this with you, Andy, right? So we have on our Dynatrace site itself, we have some Google Analytics running. And I wanted to, as an experiment, I wanted to export the RUM data and the performance data from RUM data from our site and try to merge it with the Google Analytics data into the Google Analytics database, so that you could do, multi-analytical cross-referencing and all, something that a customer might do. And I remember, I think it was you, Andy, who gave me the perfect excuse to not do it. Because if it wasn't you, whoever it was said it, was how are you cannot link the RUM data to the Google Analytics data. You can correlate, but you can't, there's no connection between that data. It's just timestamps. A transaction, there's a homepage hit registered at this time in Google Analytics and a homepage hit registered at this time in Dynatrace, but you can't necessarily say those two are the same, right? You can't marry that data. You can do some correlation of that data, but it's not directly tied. Whereas when you start getting these tools that are developed to capture all of the data in one place, you have all of that direct, not even just correlation, but the causation. You can say, here was a slow, or here was user X, here's their actual homepage hit, here's the slowness, So the multiple tool approach, I think, just has a lot of limitations in that, where you're kind of saying, well, it appears that this is related to this because they're in the approximately the same time frame. And that's something I think we don't have the need to stick with doing anymore, because more and more tools like ourselves or anything are capturing all the data that's required to do this the proper way.
It is an organizational challenge though, right? Because as Andy said, everybody brings their own tools to the party, and then it's whoever has the loudest voice, kind of tends to win. I mean, it kind of goes back to the first one, right? Where you need a voice of truth. And I think that's really, really important, because I've just seen, organizations spin out because they're spending 90% of their time arguing about, which tool is the voice of truth, right? And I think even though we acknowledge that every tool is imperfect and, every tool probably has a sweet spot of what they do really well and what they don't do really well, at some point, I think, organizations have to say, well, it's not a perfect measuring stick. No measuring stick necessarily is, but it's the one we're going to use, right, for this next period. Maybe that period is, the next year or the next fiscal year or the next, big releases. Because if you don't, I think you just spend so much time in kind of interdepartmental fighting around, what is the right metric versus actually optimizing. And I mean, I think I don't know if you guys see this too, but for me, having done this for 18, 19 years, I tell people, the biggest issue with performance is organizational culture. It's not performance, right? Because everybody's always asking us like, oh, you work with hundreds of customers every year. And so, what's the solution? Is it this tool? Is it this cloud? Is it this technology stack? Blah, 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 right? Is this CDN, this tag manager? What's the thing that's going to help us be the best and the fastest? And it's like most technology to me is agnostic, right? It's like, well, you can make technology really bad and you can make it really good using the same stack or the same, kind of implement, it's all how you implement it. But really it's the culture, of performance. And it's starting with your dev teams and your QA teams and your ops teams and kind of the misalignment across all those silos that at least in my experience, that's what really differentiates top sites. And I say top in terms of like performance versus, kind of everyone else that's not doing so well. So I don't know if you guys went into that too, but I really do think organizational culture in silos is one of the biggest, challenges to high performing kind of effective sites actually.
Yeah, I see that too, but I have maybe a different, not a different angle on it, but let me explain this. So we all know that the biggest goal of every company is obviously to make money. And so if they would have a top level goal of saying we need to increase revenue by 10%, then this should be broken down like as an OKR, like as a measurable key objective. And if the organization doesn't have silos, the teams talk with each other, then every team underneath the CEO, which should be every team, should figure out what can we contribute to that 10% and how can we measure it accurately, what contribution we have. And I believe this is where the moment where all the teams should get together when, let's say, the goal is set out for 10% revenue increase, and the marketing people can come in and say, well, we have some new campaigns. Well, how do we measure it? Well, we need some type of tool that can measure online campaign efficiency. And then the performance team can say, well, we believe that we can make your sites faster and we want to contribute X% to that. And how do we measure it so that we can actually see if we really move the needle as much as we want it and set out to versus you. And then it goes on and on and on. So I believe it really is as you said, it has to be a clear directive from the top down what we want to achieve as an organization. And then it has to be broken down into the individual teams that contribute to the business success. That should be pretty much every team in the organization. And once they sit down, they need to figure out, okay, how can we really measure the goal and our progress towards that common goal that we have. In a functional organization, I know it's easier said than done, but in a functional organization, I would assume that people then come together. Well, one thing we need to have something that allows us to measure all these things in a way so that every individual department can accurately say, this is how much we move the needle. And there's no question about your data is strange, my data is better, and so on and so forth. And I think if you do it from the top down and break down the goals and then also figure out how to measure it, then you probably come to the conclusion that we want to do as a team, and now let's figure out which technology we're using to get this achieved. But let's not pick individual island solutions.
I think that's hard. Yeah, I agree totally. I think that's just in practice when you have these organizations that we work with that have outsourced agencies that are doing part of the technology. They have kind of legacy technology stacks blending with new technology stacks. They have business teams that, are kind of not super cross-functional. It's super challenging. So I totally agree with that, idea, almost like a nirvana kind of idea, right? Like the OKRs from the top and then everything else flows. But I just think in our customer base, at least the ones we get to work with, which tend to be larger, right? Fortune kind of 100 customers. That's a big, big challenge. And it's one that you can't solve with technology. I think you're exactly right. It's about kind of organizational structure and about goals and about common language and kind of common, metrics that you're all pulling for. But that's a big one that I think interrupts the ability for folks to really get done what they want to get done and really, develop and maintain awesome sites, I guess. So.
Yeah. But even if you brought up the example with, you have some external vendors or service folks that are delivering parts of your infrastructure, parts of your applications, and they may have their own toolset, but shouldn't you be able to dictate as an organization if you're bringing in external services and external providers, can you dictate them or ask them to just contribute the same metrics or the same, use something that is relatable with all the other metrics, and then you maybe come to a conclusion that you have to kind of standardize on the same tools. I think, if I'm company X and I'm bringing in a third-party provider, then I obviously spend a lot of money with them, and part of that contract should also be accurate measurement that can be correlated, or not only correlated, but actually make sense for reporting back up to our global goals. And because I hear this constantly that we have an external provider, they sit somewhere else, and we don't know what they do, and they use some strange tools and they give us some reports, and all the reports look good, but we don't really know what they mean.
But I think that's the challenge. Is there's misaligned incentives there, right? So the third party, provider, let's say, maybe their goal is, hey, we just want to make more money, right, and do more stuff for this company, and we're going to protect ourselves by these opaque SLA reports or KPI reports that aren't aligned, right? And if you're not as strong, and that's from the company side, I think you're right. If you have the right leadership and culture and kind of approach, you probably can in your contracts align those two pieces. But I think what happens a lot of times is, that contract was negotiated with procurement or with this business person who's no longer there. And, that wasn't set up very well. And now it's like this almost adversarial relationship where the vendor is saying, no, we're providing you these metrics to prove we're doing a good job, even if those metrics are nonsensical, right? And the business people are saying, oh man, this contract wasn't negotiated very well, and we don't even understand what these metrics mean, and we're not happy, but we can't really get out because they're meeting. It's a very much a cultural, kind of procedural issue than it is a performance issue. But yeah, I think you're right. If you have the right, kind of upfront understanding and expectations, you probably can build that in. But I think a lot of our customers just don't have that, or hey, this legacy partner that's been here forever, or there's some SLA report that they're showing us that they're doing a good job, but it doesn't really translate into real world, kind of customer satisfaction or whatever. So I think that's a big challenge for sure.
Yeah, well, hopefully, with especially you and your team, right, we're not only, telling our customers that there's opportunities to make things better, but also guide them in the way to get there. And, whether you want to call it biz DevOps or whatever you want to call it, I believe part of what I always feel so proud of as a Dynatrace employee is that we're not just a tool vendor, even though obviously we love our tool, but we're not just a tool vendor, but we are, at least I see myself, and I know that most people within Dynatrace see themselves as a partner to our customers in getting them to the next stage, and that includes sometimes obviously tools, but most often is showing them a better way of doing things, and because we can go back and have a lot of years of experience, like you said, have 20 years of experience in that space, and a lot of our colleagues in the service organization have a lot of experience and saw a lot of other companies and how they transformed. We saw our own transformation, and therefore we just want to make sure that everybody out there knows we're not just a tool vendor. We are your partner that helps you to make the next right move towards a better functioning organization and surviving in the digital age, which is what it's really all about these days.
That was a great little commercial for services, Andy. Thank you. Yeah. I owe you a beer or something.
And you brought a tear to my eye, Andy. It was so sincere. It was so sincere. It's true. I know. I'm busting your chops. It's totally true, though. We're starting to run low on time. I think this is the last topic on here. It looks like it might be a fun one. So I do want to make sure we get to it. Because I even love the way Ben put it, the scourge of the internet. All right, let's talk about third-party content. I think, unless anybody else has any objections of topics, but this one I think is, I think we all see almost immediately every time we engage with anybody, so much third-party content, and I think it's just out of hand. And I think it's
a great topic. I mean, it's one of the biggest areas that we work with our customers on, and really hasn't changed over the last 10 years. It's gotten worse, but in terms of like, there hasn't been a great solution. So, for your listeners, right, third-party content, the way I think about it is there's kind of three types of content, right? There's first party, which is your content coming from your domains, you own it, right? Your JavaScript, your images, your CSS, your HTML, whatever. There's second party, which most people probably haven't heard that term, but we're trying to make it popular. And that's really not your content. But so it's actually a different vendor, a third party vendor, but it's critical for the render or functionality of the page, right? So an example of that is you might have a personalization service that's provided by a different company that when I come in, it reads my cookie and it gives me some, different content that's slightly personalized, right? That would be kind of an example of a second party. I don't own it. I don't own the technology, the hosting, the kind of operational quality of that vendor, but it's critical to my customer or to the render or usefulness of the page.
It has a business function, right?
Yeah, exactly. And then there's true third party, which is the way I think about it, the most simplest is your users could care less that this is on the site, right? So the actual customers, they don't get any value from it, but you as an organization are getting value, right? And whether that is analytics, right? Then there's a whole host of analytics stuff, including kind of session replay and analytics and tracking, or it's tracking campaign effectiveness, tracking media buy effectiveness. There's endless kind of tracking in that third party group. And I think that's what becomes challenging is, business people get very excited about adding this stuff, right? Because it provides them some business value or you hope it does. And then, the technology teams kind of get steamrolled and say, okay, we need to put this on the site. And then what happens is, you kind of get this very bloated, site experience where there's all this stuff that the user could care less about that is slowing down performance, right? And it's been implemented in not the ideal way. It's implemented too high on the page. It's blocking. It's not done in a very elegant way. And again, no offense to the technology teams. It's a lot of times they're just given the mandate, like, hey, you got to put this on, and then they talk to the vendor, and it's like the vendors. Oh, of course, these third-party vendors. The thing that kills me is they always, in their instructions for implementation, are like, load us at the very top of the page, right? Load us, before everything else. Well, why? Well, because they want to get their money. They want to show that they're providing value, but that doesn't really balance the kind of tracking that your customer doesn't care about, but you care about, with the actual user experience and performance. And so I think that's really the challenge is, business gets sold these things, they get implemented poorly, they kill user experience. And it's a bummer. It kind of goes back to, Andy, what you were saying. It's like, our customers can only control what they can control. So they've done a great job in hosting and CDNs and optimization and backend and, image optimization. And then the site still sucks. And it's like, well, why? Oh, because you have 30 third parties that, you don't control that are actually slowing down performance. And it's a major, major challenge. And it's not just media sites, and it's not just the sites you think about that might have a lot of analytics or tracking or whatever. It's really every site. I mean, it's very rare now for me to come into a customer and not see this being one of the top three issues on their pages is third parties. So I don't know, it was a very long rambling introduction to that topic, but you can tell I'm passionate about it and about kind of fixing it.
Let me stop you right there, though, because I want to address the elephant in the room, right? The biggest complaint you had, well, not the biggest, but one of the biggest things I heard you talking about was this analytics thing has to be loaded first, right? And I do want to say that's our mantra as well, right? Now, we serve a different purpose, but I just because I want a full disclosure kind of thing. Let's talk about that for a second, though, right? Because when we talk about loading our RUM tag in to get these metrics, we're always saying it should be loaded first. How do you see that, or what is the difference, if you see any, between that and other type of analytics or tracking that may be, I don't know, I don't want to put any words in your mouth at all. Is there any way you address that? I'm putting you on the spot here.
It's an interesting topic that is a little awkward, especially if I've gone on a rant about third parties and then I'm talking to the customer about adding Dynatrace, right? And there's different ways you can add our tags. So a lot of our customers will do it in a tag manager, which then you can kind of defer it and you kind of make that trade-off of missing some data potentially, but deferring the load. That's called an agentless deployment. But that's Some of our customers do that don't have the full stack of Dynatrace. But you're right. Yeah, if you're going to auto inject it via the one agent, then it will load pretty high on the page. But I think that gets to the trade-off with all third parties, which is what is the functionality that's being provided, and what is the quality of that actual tag, right, or that integration. And that's where it becomes really interesting. Is I think our Dynatrace stuff, actually we can get that beacon or get that JavaScript down pretty quickly. It's auto injected pretty quickly, and you can kind of show what the actual performance overhead is. Versus some of these third parties, I think, they're not technology companies like we are, and they're just putting their stuff out there, and then they have no idea how bad it is. I mean, you wouldn't believe the number of times I'll go with a customer to one of their vendors that's a third-party vendor with data and say, this is, this tag is taking a second, 2 seconds, or it's crazy variable, or it's horrible in this part of the country. And the third-party vendor is like, you can just tell when you talk to their technology folks, they're just clueless, right? So I mean, that's a roundabout way of answering the question, but it's saying, yeah, I think you have to make that trade-off of functionality versus impact to the customer, and then watch it very closely, right? And we always encourage our customers to monitor these third parties, right? Which you can do, right? You can see what's happening in a waterfall, and make sure that the trade-off that is being made there about functionality versus performance is worth it, right? And so that's kind of how I would answer the question for Dynatrace. But yeah, it can be an awkward discussion if I've just gone on a big rant about how much I hate third parties. Sure,
it's a bit more first party too if you're running full stack. So
exactly, and criticality. I mean, the funny thing is, you'll go to a customer, and I'm not kidding you. I would say almost 90% of customers, when we go and say, here's all the third parties that are running on your site, no one can tell me what they are. In other words, like, most people are like, I have no idea what this is. I have no idea why this is on the site. And it's because third parties call third parties, and really, I guess, is that a fourth party? I don't know. But, there's this kind of spider web effect, and most of the folks we deal with have no idea what this stuff is doing. And so one of the things we suggest right out of the gate is don't start with kind of, just pulling stuff off, but do an audit of, is this stuff needed? Like, who put it on there? What was the business value? Is it still providing that business value, right? Obviously, if you can throw performance in there, is it a bad performer, which would then make it more of a candidate for removal? But that's a starting point. Is like, most of our customers just have no idea where the stuff is coming from. And that sounds crazy. It's not like their site's been hacked and it's like, virus third party. It's just that they don't know. It's legacy stuff. It's stuff that is loading other stuff that they weren't aware of. And that's, I mean, that alone is a good first initiative. And that could take customers months, because it's not about, I mean, we can tell them what the third party, domains are. It's about them actually finding an owner in the organization, right? That can be really challenging for sure.
I want to add one aspect to this, not continuing exactly the discussion you had, but coming back to third party in general. I'm sure both of you remember, I'm not sure how many years it was, 5, 6, 7 years ago, Super Bowl was always the big thing for us to analyze performance of websites, and obviously third party was always there on the top. But one thing that I remember very vividly was the success that GoDaddy had back in the days, and I believe their story was during the Super Bowl, I think in an hour before they were airing their ads, they were taking off all the third-party components, because their mantra was, well, it's better to survive and get all these people on our website, and then showing all these fancy third-party components, high-res images, and all that stuff. So let's figure out what is the bare minimum we need for our website, and show that during the peak hour, and then switch back. Now, obviously, that was very successful, but what I thought of this was, well, if you can survive with the bare minimum, why not revisit the bare minimum and compare it with what you have right now, every sprint or every month, every quarter, and figure out what you can shave off, because obviously you are doing business just as fine, in most cases, I would assume, if you remove some of these third parties.
Yeah. Now, I would also contribute to that, because I know Ben was talking a lot about third parties with things like different trackers and things. But, I want to throw in there like fonts, right? We see a lot of third party fonts being added. Sometimes third party CSS things being downloaded from external places.
jQuery coming from external places.
Yeah,
sometimes.
but I mean, fonts especially. I mean, I've been seeing a lot of clamor about fonts lately. And it brings back kind of to your point, Andy, like what is that font? Is that font really doing anything? Is that font really helping the business drive a better need? Because you now have to load this font and re-render it. But, you know, why? Yes, it's nice for things to look nice, right? But if, you know, I always go back to the fact that one time, I was able to load Windows 2000 on my PC with 5 floppy disks, right? You know what I mean? And that was pretty big for itself back then, right? But it's just the whole bloated, just because we have the bandwidth, just because we have the speed doesn't mean you have to put every single bell and whistle in your site, because that just means there's so much more potential for disaster to strike along any one of those components. So to your point, Andy, going back and saying, what can we strip out? What's critical? What's not critical? And you can even collect the performance metrics afterward, right? You're like, hey, let's pull out this font. Did that have any impact on our conversions? No. Great, because we didn't need it, you know? Of course, you're not going to be using console font, although I love that. But anyway, that's just my little soapbox on that.
I think it's a good point. And I think, Andy, the idea of kind of measuring with and without is really interesting. And we see customers where if you pull their third parties off, or they do for certain reasons, it can, you know, improve performance by 50% or more, right? And so that again goes to the point of like, you know, your technology people might be doing everything they can to optimize, but they're optimizing a very small portion of what's actually driving page performance. I will say one note of caution is I have had customers that say, well, we want to measure ongoing our pages without any third parties, right? And they're not doing it for the way you said, which is to sort of strip down and kind of, you know, hey, what should we add back in? They're just like, well, that's all we can control. And so our team is gold or bonused on what we can control. And my challenge with that is like, that doesn't exist, right? You're measuring something that doesn't exist anywhere. So your customers are struggling, but you're reporting to your management, oh, hey, our performance is 1 second. Well, yeah, but in a totally artificial sense, right? So you can take that concept too far and start to sort of say, well, because I don't control the third parties, I just want to measure what I can control. But the reality is your customers are struggling, right? And that's why I think it is so important to go back to kind of the real end customer measurement, which is RUM, or, you know, understanding, you know, that with real user. What are your customers experiencing? It doesn't matter that, you know, you think you only control this first party stuff. The customers are struggling. And that's, you know, at the end of the day, what matters most to all of us, I think. So.
Yeah, I agree. Brian, do you think, I know Ben, I'm sure, as you said, you know, this is a topic that is dear to your heart, and we went through a large list now, but considering the time and considering that we want to maybe keep some additional things for the future, because there's always stuff coming up that we want to share. We may want to invite you as a third-time guest. I believe, Brian, if you're okay with it, let's wrap it up.
You want to summon the summarator?
Do it now.
I want to summon the summarator, yeah, because you didn't have the summarator last time when you guys were chatting.
I think I tried to do did I try to do one or no? I don't recall. I have to go back and look. Yeah. So for everybody, if hopefully you just listened to episode 70 before this one, so you know, right? And if you haven't, shame on you. Anyway, Andy, go. Go on, Andy. Exactly. Let's bring it on.
So a wealth of information. Thanks, Ben, for sharing. I think what I learned is that RAM monitoring real users is the ultimate truth, as we said. But I think we also learned that it's not only about individual page load times that we measure, but it's very important to measure the user journey, the full user experience, because otherwise you're just optimizing individual steps along the way. But if you don't understand where users actually get lost on their track, then you may optimize for the wrong thing. I believe I also learned that it's very important to consolidate and to sit down with all of your different teams that have a vested interest in monitoring different aspects of performance, and figure out how to consolidate on tooling and on metrics, so that everyone that contributes to the business success of the company has accurate metrics and understands how their metrics impact others in their organization. So how does a marketing metric impact the performance, or the other way around, so that in the end they know what impact they have when they make improvements. And we talked about the top to bottom goal setting and then pushing it down to the individual teams, and the teams then figuring out what they need to measure and what they need to do and what they can contribute to improving things. I know we also talked a lot about different toolings. It's a reappearing topic. Obviously, there's a lot of tools out there that a lot of different teams bring in different tools. We believe we have a great solution to that with Dynatrace. But Dynatrace aside, I believe there's other things we learned today, like in the very end, when we talked about third parties. So third parties are still a big challenge out there. Ben, you said it, every time when you walk into an organization and you open up their waterfall, you see how much content is on there from third parties and how that impacts performance. We all believe it's bad if the answer is, well, we can't control that. That's obviously not good, because then you're living in your own little, let's say, side universe, and you only see your world, and you're not really making a big impact on the larger scale. I learned a lot, and that's always great. Ben, we worked together years and years ago when we were still working for different companies, and we were focusing on web performance. Now we are focusing on end user performance. We're focusing on user experience performance and how to optimize that. And it's great to have you on the team with your team, with your experience, and great to know that our customers, as I said earlier, not only have a vendor that they can trust, but also a valid partner and a trusted partner, and we're happy to help them.
That was such a great summary, Andy, and thanks again, guys, for having me. It's always fun to talk to like-minded performance people. So it was a great another hour spent with you guys.
And thank you for joining with us. You're now officially a member of the 2-Timers Club. The next goal will be to be on the 3-Timers Club. That's the next level up.
All right.
I think you have a lot of exposure to a lot of cool things that you're seeing, and hopefully you'll be able to be back with us soon and share some recent experiences or some other topics, I'm sure, that we haven't quite covered yet. Want to thank you for being on again, and just want to give a warning to everybody. If you do have Halloween candy and Andy Candy Grabber is around, look out, because he will take it. Andy, though, in all seriousness, I hope your voice, you just sounded so down today. It kind of made me sad. And I hope.
I feel great, but it's just my voice. I'm sorry. I've been talking too long today, and my voice has, over the weekend something happened to my voice. I don't know what it was.
I hope you recover.
I'm sure I will.
And I want to thank everyone for listening once again. If you have any questions or comments, you can tweet them at us at pure_DT or send an email at pureperformance@dynatrace.com. If you have any show topic ideas you'd like to hear us talk about, or even if you have stories and you might want to be a guest on the show, you can reach out to us through those means as well. So long for me, Andy and Ben.
Thank you. Make sure whoever is on the call, and if it's before end of January, to sign up for Perform.
Oh, yes.
2019 is coming up end of January. And Ben, actually, you have a hot day session, right? A hands-on training day on Monday.
I do. Yep, I will be there. Yeah, we're doing a Monday session.
I'll be doing a hot day as well. And I think we'll be, or at least, well, Andy, you'll be running around, but we'll be doing podcasting from there as well again, I believe. So, yes, Perform 2019. And, for anybody who comes, I just want to remind you, it will be my birthday while we're out there, so please bring me a gift. There's no better way to show your appreciation for this podcast than to come bring me a gift. Possible best gifts would be expensive bottles of scotch.
Absolutely, yeah.
Got it. I'll have to remember that.
Or anything. I'll even take a pat in the back. All right. Thank you, everybody.